There's a QR code.
Yep.
Apparently, parking is a bit challenging, so but hopefully people will come in and sit in the front row in their spare seats. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Kate Chaney, the MP from this area, and I'm with Catherine, who I'll tell you a little bit more about in a second. I want to start by acknowledging the Whadjuk people. The Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional owners of the land that we're on, as we sit on the edge of Warden Budja, the sea land, the ocean lands, and enjoy the beautiful view that we have today. So I pay my respects to elders past and present. Now, I'm really thrilled to be here tonight with Dr. Catherine Williams, who has been the most fantastic asset to me in the time that I've been in Parliament. She is the Executive Director of the Centre for Public Integrity, which is a small but mighty organisation that does a lot of work about how we can make government better. Catherine is an expert in democratic accountability and public policy reform, and her research spans political finance, executive accountability and lobbying regulation. And she co-authored Keeping Them Honest with the late Stephen Charles KC, and regularly contributes expert analysis to parliamentary inquiries and to public debate on transparency and integrity reform. So I've been really grateful for Catherine's work over the last few years, and I'm thrilled that she has made the trek across the country to come and speak with us today. So thanks for being here, Catherine.
No, now working? Yeah, sorry. Thanks so much for having me, Kate. I'm really pleased to be here with all of you this evening.
Great, thank you. Now we might start, I think Sarah was being quite bossy with the Slido survey at the beginning. Good on you, Sarah. And we thought this would be a good way to set the scene to talk about the issues that we're talking about tonight, information integrity. So we might start by looking at the results of that. The first question was, where do you source trusted information? You may not be able to see it, but I'll tell you the highlights if you can't see it. So 72% there, television, radio and newspapers, followed by state and federal government sources, and then friends and family. Now, I think we should recognise there's probably some self-selection bias in this audience too, that you are the people who are interested and curious and worried about information integrity. But I think it's interesting if you think on a long time scale. You know, a long time ago, when we had an oral tradition, we only got information from family and friends, people around us. Then probably moved to religious institutions, then with the printing press, newspapers, and then professional journalism in the 20th century. And now this digital shift is changing things again. But still television, radio and newspapers are trusted by this community. The next question was about which of the following knowledge institutions are you most likely to trust? And we'll talk a bit more about knowledge institutions and their importance. CSIRO comes out on top at 82%. And I think we'll be talking about how important it is that we have these organisations that can do independent research. CSIRO did just have their funding cut, which is a concern. Universities, next, Bureau of Meteorology, and then medical research institutes. And so this is the landscape that we'll be talking a little bit more about. Interestingly, I saw some data from the 2025 APS Trust in Australian Public Services report that said the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is the most trusted, followed by the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme and Medicare. So we do have some institutions that are still trusted. Our next question was about ranking these popular media formats in order of your usage. So radio is at the top there. I think that would be an unusual result nationally. The reason you all had to wait outside was I was doing a radio interview with ABC about gambling reform in here and needed a quiet space. But I think, oh hang on, has that changed? Oh yeah, radio is number one. I think nationally, despite us saying radio, news websites, radio app, television, podcasts, social media is right down here at number 7. Nationally, social media is at the top, with 94% of Australians claiming to use social media at least weekly, followed by television, 80% weekly, and streaming services, 78%. So we've got to recognise that this is not a representative crowd for the Australian population. Number 4, how confident do you feel evaluating the accuracy and credibility of information? So the score out of 5, 38, the average is 3.5. So 16% say 5 out of 5, 38%, 4 out of 5. An interesting stat on this, I think, is that some research shows that young adults believe that they won't be scam victims and only older Australians fall for scams. When you actually look at misinformation tests, Generation Z, which I know I'm not quite part of, slightly too old, performed worse than any other generation, including baby boomers, on misinformation tests. But they were the most accurate in assessing their own abilities. So that was interesting. Thinking that you might not be good at it is a separate skill to actually determining the misinformation. So having some doubt about your ability to recognise it is probably an important thing. So those who rated themselves 1, 2 or 3 there, it's good that you have some doubt, I suppose, because that scepticism is important. So young people expressed high confidence in their judgments but struggled to actually detect false information. And that's another cause for concern. I think that's the end of the questions now, isn't it? Oh no, 3 more, sorry. How much do you agree with these statements? Oh, I don't have the comparison data here. So, laws and regulation are needed to manage risks associated with generative AI. And there's pretty high agreement in this room, and that's probably why you're here. And that I think we've only got 2024 data. It was a little bit less than that, but I think there is still pretty broad recognition that this is an emerging risk that we need to deal with. The next one, I worry generative AI is being developed too quickly. 85% agree with that. That has increased, that would be an increase on a couple of years ago. The data we have is from 2024. But I think even in the last month, I've heard a lot more conversations about the speed at which AI is moving and the concerns that raises for people. And I think generative AI will harm Australian society. So there's less, so 53% agree, 41% don't know. And I think it's true that we don't know yet. This is very much an emerging area, and we are working it out as we go along. So really useful one more, sorry. Which of the following would you like to know more about? And this is useful for me in thinking about future events. How to find news that's reliable and trustworthy. Hopefully you'll have a few pointers on that by the end of the night. How to identify and respond to misinformation. And that is definitely a skill that we need to all build. So we might feed that into future event planning. How to protect myself from scams and predators. How to use new technology. 50% are interested in that. So that's really useful for us to know. And I think that desire for balanced information is a really good sign and a good way for us to move into the body of this event. So thank you for sharing your views. It gives Catherine a good sense of who she's talking to tonight, and also us some good information about future events. So now we'll move on to making the most of Catherine's expertise. We're going to talk about what information integrity is, what happens when we don't have it, why there are more risks and that those risks are growing around information integrity, and then really importantly, what can actually be done done about it. So Catherine, I might hand over to you just to talk a little bit about what information integrity actually is.
Great, thank you. So, information integrity is an ideal that no well-functioning democracy can do without. And if we see on one side, on the negative side, misinformation and disinformation, then information integrity is the antidote, the positive to it, right? And at the Centre for Public Integrity, when we're thinking about what information integrity is, we're thinking about it as a concept that is, that the maintenance of which is required to support the information environment that informed political judgment depends upon. And we see it as a democratic principle, akin to democratic principles like electoral integrity, judicial independence, the rule of law, and like those principles, information integrity is underpinned by public law values of transparency and accountability and constraints on the exercise, on the misuse of power, and institutional arrangements that are designed to secure public trust. So it's a really exciting and emerging area, something to feel, in my view, optimistic about, when we can sometimes feel a bit pessimistic about how we regulate this and disinformation.
Despite you wanting us to feel optimistic about it, can you paint a picture of why it matters? Like, what happens if we don't have that information integrity?
Well, the consequences are really, really significant for our society. We know that misinformation and disinformation, really sadly, are an increasingly common part of the practice of democracy, unfortunately. But we know, for example, through the work of Professor Lisa Hill, who by chance actually is the Centre for Public Integrity's Research Chair, who's done a lot of work around the risks that mis and disinformation present to democracy. We know that these risks include things like manipulation of voter preferences, polarisation of the electorate, undermining of trust in our democratic institutions, and an increase to voters at the cost of voting, because you've got to spend time sorting through information to determine what is good information and what is bad information. And we see the harms that manifest particularly in policy areas that are characterised by high contestation and the dominance of powerful vested interests. So talking about policy areas like climate and the energy transition, and of course we saw it very closely in the 2023 Voice referendum, where the information environment was distorted by mis and disinformation. So we know that in the absence of information integrity, we have really serious and structural risks to the conditions that representative government needs to flourish.
So it's bad for individuals and also for institutions.
Exactly right.
Yeah. And if we can just talk a little bit about how that landscape is changing, like what are the factors that are changing our information integrity in now?
It's changing so rapidly, isn't it? There's so much that's changing, and the pace at which it's changing is really quite frightening, I think, in a sense. There's an interesting podcast series. If you've not listened to it, I really highly recommend it, by a Churchill fellow called Michelle Ainsworth, and the podcast title is Truth, Trust and Democracy, and she delves into some of these issues, and as I say, I would really, really highly recommend it to you. She talks about how some of the people she interviews talk about how it's no longer just enough to talk about how to get information and to teach people what information is. We really need now to be focusing on teaching people how to assess and judge the value of information, if it's good information or bad information. So that's obviously a very significant shift, and we're so behind in trying to help our populace inoculate, in a sense, our populace against the harms of mis and disinformation, because we're not doing that yet. And another significant change, I think, Kate, is that the information environment has become participatory in a way it wasn't before. So whereas perhaps previously people were passive consumers of news information, you now have an opportunity in some media to participate by producing content or liking content, sharing it, commenting on it, and that is a role that's new to us. And then we're not yet used to playing that role either. So a lot's changing so fast, and our regulatory responses just are not, as we all know.
I mean, we've always played that role of hearing something and sharing it with family and friends. Why is it different online?
So it's different online because previously you may have been receiving that information from a public broadcaster. You may have been receiving it from an independent and legitimate authoritative source of information. But when you're receiving it online, particularly when you're receiving it on social media, you don't know, it's difficult for you to tell if it's credible information or not. And there's some really interesting research that was done by a series of universities together, the University of Canberra, University of Western Sydney, RMIT and QUT as well, that looked at the percentage of adult Australians who aren't actually able to determine whether information is authentic information or not. It's a really high percentage. 97% of us weren't able to do that. So it's a problem now when the information is not just coming from established legitimate sources of information. It's coming from everywhere, and we're not good. Clearly we're not good at determining whether it's good or bad information.
Can you talk about AI?
Yeah, sure. Look, AI. So I just wonder if there's anyone in your audience, I think you and I had some correspondence about this, whether there's anyone in your audience who's seen that deep fake, the ABC article that suggests a stoush had occurred between Alan Kohler and Matt Common. If you've not seen it, you really should go and have a look at that. It's quite incredible. And Alan Kohler talking about it implied that they had to fight on
Just point it direct.
Is that any better? It's a lot better. It's too much now. And what Alan Kohler said in the aftermath, that was really interesting. He said that, well, if we can't trust what we're seeing on it, then social media's got to be dead. And I think, I think we can only hope, in a sense, that were the case, because it poses such harm to our democratic system in the absence of sufficient regulation and sufficient positive action by the state. So I think it's an interesting example of AI to go and have a look at. I think that we need to be thinking really seriously about how we try to regulate AI. There are some interesting ideas being explored around the world. So one example is the Defending Democracy from Deepfake Deception Act in California, and there, in the 120-day period leading up to an election, AI-generated content is either blocked or needs to be labelled as AI-generated content. So it's an innovative concept. These are the sorts of things that we need to be thinking about to respond to the challenge that AI presents.
There are three reasons I think AI is a threat in this space. Firstly, because it's plausible but not reliable information. And if you now do a Google search and there's a little AI summary at the top, and reasonably often it's not right, but it sounds quite authoritative. So that's it appears to be pretty good. Secondly is deep fakes, and I have to say I find it terrifying that anyone could make a video of me saying things that I've never said before. There's enough content of me out there so that it could be done quite well, and going into the next election or at any time, that can be put out there. And I met with some psychology researchers at UWA who were telling me about some research done that shows that even when someone's told, if they're shown a negative AI thing about someone, even if they're told that was fake, the person still thinks worse of that individual. So that's, we're programmed to believe our eyes, and so it's going to be very hard to retrain to not believe our eyes anymore. And the third thing is that the lack of transparency about how it actually works, and we don't know how these algorithms are being used and what's being spat out to us. And that black box element of it is another way that another technology-enabled risk that is growing from on information integrity. What about journalism and the way that's shifted?
So it's a troubling landscape, obviously. If we think about public broadcasters and quality public interest journalism as performing a really important function in our democracy, because they can expose corruption and misconduct, and they can also, when they're good, they can explain complex policy ideas in a way that's accessible to the public. So they've got a vitally important function to perform. And obviously the public broadcasters encounter funding challenges, commercial media profitability challenges, and instead we've got then on the other side of the coin tech companies that are able to make vast amounts of money by often doing things that are deleterious to our societies. And so we really need to see, in my view, governments step up and support public broadcasters, invest in local and independent journalism to help combat the effects of misinformation.
And just on the commercial media, it seems that quality has declined too because of these economic pressures. So as someone who advertises, if I have a choice of whether to spend $1,500 on an ad in the Post or on social media, when I put it in the Post, it goes out, I've got no idea who's seen it, whether they looked at it or flicked past it. On social media, you can target it at, this is the audience that I want to see it. And it's a much better way to spend your advertising money. And so that, the effect of that undermining the viability of commercial journalism results in things like, we're seeing now the Washington Post laying off 250 journalists, and which ends up in this vicious spiral. So that's another factor that's really changed things. And then what about content-based risks like radicalisation and disinformation?
So they are obviously really significant risks, and we need to be looking from a regulatory perspective at how to respond to them. We see, kind of risk-based regulatory approaches happening in the EU with the Digital Services Act there. We see other approaches on the content side, with the fake news law in Brazil requiring identity verification and traceability of information. So there are interesting ideas about how to deal with this problem and what the right one in the Australian context, or the combination of ones in the Australian context is. I'm not sure, that's not my specific area of expertise, but quite clearly we have to be doing something to respond to that. And
this is something that's really bothered me this year, is the polarisation and radicalisation, whether it's Bondi or the Invasion Day, rally attack. Examples of vulnerable, young men who have been radicalised online, and the impact that has in the real world, not just the online world. And when you combine that with the manosphere, incel sort of trends, and then sovereign citizens, and the way people can just go down those rabbit holes and be polarised and attack each other the whole time, and live in a completely different information world. And the impact that has on social cohesion is something that has been really top of mind for me, I think not just overseas, but here this year.
And there are obviously some really deep-seated problems with radicalisation and the manosphere and so on. I think it does highlight, though all of these examples highlight the need for better civics education and media and digital literacy. It really, for me, those examples really highlight that, because we're not doing any of those things well in Australia. We've started to see some progress on the civics education front in South Australia, where the government's made a very determined effort to invest in that and embed civics education throughout the curriculum in South Australia. It's a really positive step. We hope it's something that governments around the rest of the country will look to. But on the media and digital literacy front, there was of course the JSCAM following the inquiry into civics education. The report came out in 2025 and made some really interesting recommendations about this. We know that the Commonwealth Government has at the moment out a tender to co-design its strategy, but the tender closes in March. I think the strategy will be planned to be delivered in 2028, and then of course after that there's implementation. So we're really a long way off at the moment from where we need to be.
There doesn't seem to be a sense of urgency about it, and civics education has gone backwards, I said, on that inquiry, and a declining proportion of year 10s actually meet the level of something like 34% or something, actually meet the level required at that level. So it is vital. And there are some countries that are doing it really well, aren't there?
Finland probably won't surprise anybody that Finland's a country that does some of these things really well. And on the civics education front and how inadequate at the moment our education is, this has real world consequences. Some of my colleagues in South Australia have done a really interesting research project where one jurisdiction opened up old ballot boxes to them, and they examined the ballots and using a particular methodology determined which invalid votes had been cast accidentally. And the percentage of it it's sadly very high. So you've got, okay, some people are intentionally casting votes that aren't valid votes, but it appears in their research that there's a percentage of people who are trying to cast a valid vote in the election of their government, and they're not managing to do it properly. Now, surely that is, in a democracy, the most basic civic competency. We can't even get that right at the moment, so we're some way off on the digital and media literacy front.
I have to share with Catherine now a fact about Curtin that you may not know. At the last election, Curtin had the lowest informal vote of any electorate in the country for 34 years. But yeah, it is still very much a problem. So before we go into the solution, we've started to talk about some of them. I do feel like we need to mention Trump.
Where would a conversation about mis and disinformation and IFB without Trump, Kate?
Yeah. I mean, what do you see in the information integrity space happening in the US?
Well, it's obvious. It's appalling. It's utterly appalling, and actually the sad thing to think about is how it will be possible to rebuild it in the future. Post-Trump, if there is a post-Trump, how are they going to fix it and build it up again? Because it's been destroyed to such a significant extent that actually then how do you fix it? It's really
It's if you look at the sort of authoritarian playbook, you know, the things that the tactics and strategies to seize and maintain authoritarian power, he's ticking them all off one by one. Cult personality, propaganda, demonising opponents and minorities, undermining democratic institutions. You know, we're seeing all these different institutions being defunded and questioned, and you know, glorifying violence and policing. And the next on the list is controlling information and education. And the fake news, you know, chorus is right there in the playbook that then creates a situation where people are so confused and they don't know what to believe anymore, and then that makes them more susceptible to looking for someone powerful who's got all the answers.
That's exactly right, and it's a warning sign in a sense to us that we can't be complacent. We need to be vigilant for our own democracy, and this is a letter, I quote this letter all the time. You may have heard me quote this letter before, I apologise if that's the case. But in the lead up to the previous time that Trump was elected, over 200 scholars of anti-authoritarianism and fascism signed an open letter And they said in that open letter that democracy is fragile and it requires vigilance and it requires protection. And I don't think that we are being sufficiently vigilant, and I don't think that we're taking the necessary protective steps now.
So if that's the US, surely we could never be like that.
Surely.
Surely. What are the warning signs that you've seen here about undermining institutions or some of those risks?
So we've had an interesting development in various places around Australia, because previously in Australia, if we look at the relationship between executive governments and the integrity agencies that oversee them, and when I talk about the integrity agencies that oversee them, I'm talking about the Integrity Commission, the Ombudsman and the Auditor General fundamentally. There previously appeared to be a relationship where the executive understood that it needed to demonstrate restraint. What we have seen more recently shows that that is really shifting in some places. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I come from Victoria, and in Victoria we had 2 examples last year of efforts by the Victorian government to undermine the Auditor General. And the first was in around February last year, when the Auditor General released a report into infrastructure spending in Victoria and highlighted huge budget increases and a real lack of transparency around government spending. And the government response, actually I wrote it down for you because I wanted to quote it to you. A minister from the Victorian government said these words: "We should reflect on the responsibility and obligation of VAGO, the Auditor General, to be accurate and uphold principles of integrity and professionalism, because quite frankly, in this report, they failed." Now, there's no indication from any independent source that that's the case. But the government's response to this report that questioned things that it was doing was to seek to attack this office. It's an independent officer of the Parliament, right? It's an unusual step. It happened again for us in November when an annual report into, I think it was the Country Fire Authority, was tabled late in Parliament, and the Premier suggested that that was a consequence of Auditor General processes. And the Auditor General took, I think, a relatively unprecedented step of issuing a detailed statement in response, setting out a timeline to show that it wasn't the Auditor General's responsibility for the purpose of maintaining confidence in the audit process. I think it's a really important step. We wouldn't want the Auditor General to be in that position, but if it's necessary, then it's important that they do it. Victoria's not the only place we've seen it. We've seen it in Tasmania relatively recently. We're following an audit that the government obviously found unfavourable. The Premier said in Parliament that the Auditor General is in effect entitled to his opinion and commentary. And these sorts of efforts to undermine these knowledge institutions, which are a central part of our information ecosystem, whether it's by politicising them, defunding them, as you said in the case of the CSIRO, or delegitimising them, they're serious attacks on information integrity, because these are organisations that generate knowledge to help inform public debate and sometimes have the function of debunking mis and disinformation. So attacks by the executive government on them are really deeply concerning, and we are, as I said, starting to see that sort of thing here too. So that worries us very much.
I think it's time to move on to the optimism. What do you reckon? So let's talk about what can actually be done. Like how do we try to protect our information integrity and grow it? And maybe, I mean, there's probably things that government can do, things media can do, things that individuals can do. Let's start with government. Over to you.
I feel I've sold you that there should be optimism, and now I hope that I can live up to what I've said. So the thing about this is that, as I said, in a sense, we're conceptualising it as two sides of the coin. So we've got mis and disinformation on the other, and then the positive, we've got information integrity. Now, if the only thing missing for the information integrity reforms is the will on the part of governments to do it, it's This is not complex stuff. The social media stuff, I think, it's complex. What I'm going to talk about now, this isn't hard, right? All that is hard here is getting the will to do these things. So what we're talking about now is the fact that the state has a responsibility to create a democratic architecture that supports information integrity. And for us, there are 7 key areas where we think the state can do this. And we think it can do it by pursuing long-term integrity reforms that help to reduce undue influence and enhance executive accountability. We think that they can do it by protecting our knowledge institutions. So when I talk about knowledge institutions, I'm talking about government expert bodies like the CSIRO and the Bureau of Statistics, our integrity agencies and our courts, our universities, research organisations and public broadcasters. They need to be protected. We can have authoritative sources of public information. That can be these government expert bodies. They can be expert panels appointed by government to have a public-facing role. There are some interesting ideas here. We need media and digital literacy is obviously a really significant part of this. We need to look at providing structured forums for citizens to have informed conversations and end up able to agree to disagree nicely, as you put it so well. There are concepts overseas. There's something in Oregon called a citizens review panel. People come together, they receive information, there are formal structured deliberations, they come in the end to a citizen's statement of information on a particular issue. We also need wider ranging citizen participation in the policy-making process, because through that, for example, through good public consultation and accountability for the quality of public consultation, with the public trust in the policy-making process will be able to be enhanced, and the dominance that we see in so many highly contested policy areas at the moment will be able to be reduced. Then at the end of it, of course, is public interest journalism, proper support for public interest journalism. So as I say, range of things that could be done if the will were there to pick it up and do it.
That sounds so easy, doesn't it?
So I did sell it well, thank you.
I want to add to that on social media. The under 16s ban, I mean, at the time I described it as a blunt instrument. I supported it. I was having a good chat to Sophie over here, who was saying she and her friends think it's a good idea too. She's just finished school. But it's not all that needs to be done in that space, because it's not like at 16 you suddenly, know everything, although sometimes you feel like you do. But the next step, I think, is a digital duty of care. And that is creating an obligation on the tech companies to actually have an overarching duty to create safe places and take reasonable steps to prevent foreseeable harms. And that's something that Zoe Daniel introduced in the last Parliament, and I think has great potential. It's not easy, but because it's changing so fast, we're going to have to put the obligation on the people who actually can control what's happening and how it's developing, to try and create those safer spaces. On media and digital literacy, I think Taiwan is a really interesting example. The democracies that are very close to big, scary other countries, like Finland near Russia, Taiwan near China, that really see mis and disinformation as a serious security threat, are doing this best. And Taiwan uses some fascinating technology-enabled tools to deeply engage with citizens and build that trust, but also take media literacy and digital literacy very seriously in schools, but also broader than that.
And the geopolitical context that it's really important. It may be one of the reasons that Australia's been so complacent for so long, because we've not butted up right next to a power that we perceive to be a dangerous power. But we do need to be looking to those exemplars in the space to see what we can pick up and use or adapt to the Australian context.
One of the things that people wanted to talk about was, how to find balanced news sources. And I think it remains an ongoing challenge. I started my morning with going from one extreme to the other and reading probably 7 apps, to 7 different news sites to try and get a balanced view. Someone from my team, Heath from my team, recently put me onto Ground News, which is a fascinating site that collates news from a whole lot of different places, assesses the bias in the publication, and then summarises that and presents a summary of the facts, and then also talks about what the left is saying about it and what the right is saying about it. So you can see the different perspectives on the same story. You might not totally agree with the sites that it has labelled as left or right, but I think it at least makes that attempt to give you those different perspectives. I just subscribed to it last night because Heath had been telling me about it. And then you can go in and say what topics you're interested in, and it gives you a short summary of the facts, and then you can dig further and see what all different publications are saying about it. Those sorts of things, I think, we need to value that and seek it. And one of the challenges, I think, is that it's really uncomfortable to read things or listen to people who don't agree with you. It's much easier to be in your own echo chamber and socialise with people who agree with you and read the publications that are aligned with your interests. But it's really dangerous. And so trying to work out how we can actually get out of that mindset is really challenging. There's some research showed that 7 in 10 people have an insular trust mindset. That is, they will only trust people who are like them. It's a huge number. And then how do you break that? Well, you're more likely to trust someone whose views differ to yours if they are open-minded, if they're transparent about their differences, and if they have helped you or defended you. And I think if you're trying to talk to someone who has a different view to you, it's really useful to remember that you're not going to convince someone by telling them they're wrong, but being curious about why they would think what they think, defending their right to think it, helping them and recognising that you have a different view and what bias that might bring to you is far more likely to be a constructive conversation. And that's something that I think individuals can do. And we try and do it with having policy events where people sit around the table and hear different perspectives to their own, in live, face-to-face IRL in real life. And I think it's very different to the online experience. I look at so much social media and think, oh my God, the world is so full of hate. And then I go door knocking, and it's lovely because people are really reasonable and kind and sensible and altruistic and care about others. And I find it so important for me to have that touchstone to meet people in their lives and remember that that's actually what people like, not what we see online.
It strikes me when you describe some of the thing that you're doing with members of your community, where you bring people in to have a discussion about a policy issue and deliberate where they might have different points of view. That you're doing one of the things that we say is an essential part of the maintenance of an ecosystem that has information integrity. You're providing that legitimate forum for informal disagreement. It's a really, really important thing.
Good. I don't have a clock on me, so I have no idea how time is tracking. Quarter past 6. Okay, we might move to questions. I think we've talked about regulation. We've talked about a little bit about what individuals can do. There's obviously lots of regulation priorities there. We'll go to questions. So we've got 2 roving microphones. Or maybe 1 roving microphone, seeing as the other one died a little bit. So if you would like to ask a question, raise your hand, and then Sarah and, is there 1 roving microphone? Sarah and Kath have the microphone, so try and get their attention, and then we'll line them up. Yes?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for the insightful exchange of information. I wanted to ask about who is to be held accountable. So we've talked a little bit about holding the platform providers of social media accountable. Is there any trends or considerations for actually holding individuals accountable for deceptive information? It hinges on that border of freedoms of speech versus not. But surely, if it's deceptive, they have to be criminalized. That would be my view. But is there any trends or considerations around passing that accountability down to individual levels?
Yeah, I'll see if the microphone's working. Look, it's a really, really good question. Not that I'm aware of in Australia. It may be, and I may well be wrong about that, but not that I am aware of. As far as I'm aware, at the moment, we're concentrating on the platforms themselves. But certainly, the question that you raise is one that should be explored if it's not already being explored.
I would add, and it's slightly tangential to your question, but on truth in political advertising, which is currently there's no requirement for it. There is in trade and commerce. You can't be misleading and deceptive if you're selling something, but if you're in politics, you can do whatever you like, apparently. Zali Steggall, one of my colleagues, has put up a bill that would use the South Australian framework on truth in political advertising at a federal level. And I supported that and included in an electoral reform bill that I put up as well. I have to say, I had a really interesting conversation with Tom Rogers, who's the ex-AEC commissioner, about it. And he's quite against the idea of legislating truth in political advertising because he says it just creates, it lets the conspiracy theories thrive. And then there's this sort of Orwellian ministry of truth idea and a sense that, someone's going to stop me from saying what I think. I don't know about that. Like I think that there do have to be some requirements on political actors to not say things that they know to be a lie. It has to be conservatively applied. It can't be opinion or hyperbole or, saying Catherine's the worst person in the world is probably not in breach of that, but saying Catherine committed a crime last week and was convicted, that should be caught. But I do recognise that Tom Rogers' perspective that civic education and media literacy and encouraging people to question what they see is a much better long-term inoculation against the conspiracy theories and the attacks that might rise.
I really agree with what you say there, and I think Tom Rogers' reflections are really interesting because in South Australia, the regulator for their laws, which have been in place now since the 80s, is the South Australian Electoral Commission. And when you speak to people in South Australia, the experience that they've had in a sense across the board, whoever you speak with says that those laws have had a positive impact on political culture in South Australia, which is why one of the reasons I think why we've been so enthusiastic to think about taking it up at the federal level. The challenge that we face, and that relates to what Tom Rogers says, is, well, who's our regulator going to be? Because in South Australia, it's the Electoral Commission. We are really lucky in Australia to have an electoral commission, a federal electoral commission, that is really, really highly trusted by the public. And do we want, if you think in a sense, like some of the academics I speak with speak about the AEC as really standing for us, the difference between us and the United States, that our citizens trust in this body to oversee the peaceful transfer of power after an election. Now, do we want to give to that regulator a responsibility that will inevitably politicise it? There's no question about that, it will politicise it. And you have to recognise that the responsibility that was given to the South Australian Electoral Commission happened at a different time, in a different global context. Would it be the right thing now? And if it wouldn't be right now for the AEC, well then who's our regulator? So we do have some complex questions about that one.
Not a simple answer. Yes.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for this. This is great. I'd like to ask about the rise of the funding of bot farms and that whole AI side of the internet that is being used to further, we've seen it quite a bit with neoliberalism recently in Australia under the Atlas project, which is coming through and being used by some of the oligarchs like Reinhardt to fund some of the more extreme right-wing groups, which are then funded outside the political sort of microscope, the bot farms that are used as echo chambers to inflame and artificially inflate the community support for some of these ideas. And this is really a government thing, because that's the only level it can be stopped at. What do you think about that sort of, well, you did touch on it, but it's pretty insidious from what I've seen and reading, so I'd be interested to see what the bigger view of that is.
Yeah, it's terrifying, I guess is my first point, but you know, bot farms, and sometimes I look at our social media and obviously the bots have got hold of it and there's a whole lot of comments, and I don't think they're real people, but there was a mis and disinformation bill introduced into Parliament in the last Parliament, which I supported. My support of it earned me graffiti in Shenton Park that said, "Chaney supports 1984. This is so ironic, isn't it? The way that law was framed was that the platforms had to have a framework of some sort for dealing with mis and disinformation, and they had to comply with their framework. That was all. It didn't say what that framework should be. So it looked like a pretty minimal requirement as far as I was concerned. It turned into, the misinformation around it turned into, it's going to clamp down on free speech, and if you say something on Facebook, you're going to be personally accountable and thrown in jail, which was not at all how it worked. I think government, and the government passed it through the lower house and then it didn't go through the Senate. I think it does need to be looked at again. I'm concerned that this government may not have the guts to do it because it does create this free speech, counter narrative. But I do think that it has an effect, because if you read something on social media and then you read 300 comments underneath that all share one perspective, it does affect how you feel about it. Just like the psychologists found that even when you know an AI thing is false about someone, you still think, oh, they do look a bit shifty though. And so I think part of that is education and learning to recognise the bots, but that's going to keep getting better. So I would like to see regulation in that area.
Just a supplementary. The US turned on like 12 hours a location device for where the account was held. And when they discovered that bot farms were all housed in the Philippines, Russia and other places, it was quickly turned off. But it was a brief moment in realising that 50% of Twitter is bot farms. And that's, pretty frightening.
Thank you for increasing the AI literacy of these 150 people. Yeah, that's
What's the bot farm?
Oh, what's a bot farm? Yeah, good question. So my understanding of a bot farm, and you may, is where a whole lot of AI agents are generating material for a particular purpose. So it creates social media accounts that are not real people, and then they all comment on a similar theme, and so it can be directed to, counter any commentary about, any positive commentary about wind farms with this negative commentary or whatever the issue is. So it's using AI to create a perception gap so that people think, the way people think the crowd thinks is different to how it actually
Can we
is.
recognise that? Can we recognise it's a bot farm?
Oh, no, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, go.
You can, because we're literally witnessing it with Pauline Hanson at the moment.
Yeah.
We're literally witnessing it with Pauline Hanson at the moment. We're seeing right-wing groups being funded by oligarchs that are using bot farms to gain the profile and gain the airspace and the media profile that we all see every day, which then scoops up the vulnerable and drags them into the belief that my sort of disgruntledness is supported by a wider group of the community than it actually is. So it's happened in America. That was exactly the playbook that's happened. It's happened in all our authoritarian governments. It's happened in the USSR. It's happened in Hungary. It's happened in the US, and we've seen the disaster that is, and it is here. It is happening today in Australia.
I'm going to ask Manisha, my social media manager behind the phone over there, to tell me what are the telltale signs you look for that make you think something's a bot?
Strange usernames.
Strange usernames.
Lots of numbers, no followers.
Lots of numbers.
No profile picture. A lot of spelling mistakes. Bad punctuation.
So watch out if you've got bad punctuation.
Sounds like me.
Well, thank you. Catherine, thank you very much. Kate, my question really relates to that and the question of transparency, both in the source of these accounts, which the source of the comments and the misinformation, and also I think you mentioned that California had through a temporary stay on identifying a period where they identified AI-generated comments prior to elections. Is it difficult to actually identify comments as an AI comment or deep fakes, or obviously deep fakes as AI generated, and actually require that sort of stamp on those comments, on those articles, other AI generated things? There's so many of them. And the other thing is, do you have a comment on what seems to be decreasing transparency of governments even in Australia?
Can I start with the second part first? So, yes, I do have a comment in respect of that. That is a trend that we are really, really worried about. So what we saw at the federal level last year, well, we've seen two things over the Albanese government's recent time in government. We have seen, in respect of its compliance with Senate orders for production of documents, and the rate at which it's claiming public interest immunity when it doesn't comply, we see that rate increasing. And to just give a bit of background on that issue for those of you who aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, upper house orders for production of documents are a really critical tool for those houses, for the parliament to use to hold the executive government to account. And it's basically the upper house saying, government, you're going to need to give us that document. Now, government in response can claim executive privilege, it's also called Crown privilege and public interest immunity. And there are going to be, it's really important to be clear, there are going to be legitimate reasons to claim that sometimes, for example, national security reasons. What we're worried about is that the rate at which government is claiming that when it refuses to produce a document is increasing. That's a problem because the government is, as a former Victorian clerk, Andrew Young, puts it, the sole arbiter of the validity of their claimed privilege, because there isn't an independent umpire who looks at the document and says, oh gosh, that's a valid claim of executive privilege or that's not a valid claim. So I know you don't have this mechanism in the Western Australian Parliament, but in New South Wales, in the upper house, there's something called an independent legal arbiter. So in the New South Wales upper house, when the government claims privilege over a document in response to an order to produce it, an independent legal arbiter who's appointed under the standing orders of that house is able to look at the document and determine the validity of the claim, right? Determine whether the executive's claim of privilege is a valid claim or not. And it was that mechanism that enabled the Greens member of the New South Wales Legislative Council, Abigail Boyd, to get government documents that enabled her to reveal the shocking stories of abuse in childcare centres in New South Wales because the government had claimed privilege, and it said it's contrary to the public interest to release this information, right? So this is a really important mechanism that we would like to see adopted in the federal parliament and in other parliaments around the country also. So we've got this issue with transparency. Then we've got freedom of information. So we did some analysis in the middle of last year that showed that the Albanese government's performance on freedom of information was a bit of a mixed bag. There were some good things, some good investment in it, some reduction, some processing timeframes. There were also some concerning indicators. Now that was in July we did that. We didn't expect that in early September we would see arrive in the Australian Parliament, in my view, the most anti-democratic piece of legislation that we have seen for a very, very long time, which was the FOI Amendment Bill that sought to significantly wind back the ability of the Australian people to access information in really significant ways. It did things like ban the ability to make anonymous FOI applications. It was going to impose a fee for FOI applications, which obviously has an impact that disadvantages the ability of marginalised groups in the community or public interest journalism potentially to make the applications they need to make. They were also going to expand cabinet confidentiality to capture more documents, and there were some changes to what we call the deliberative process test that again were going to mean more documents didn't have to be disclosed. Now fortunately that bill did not find a Senate pathway, but the intention to wind back access rights, deal with some of the problems that the government sees with the FOI system are legitimate problems, right? They need solutions. But equally, users of the FOI system also have significant challenges that need to be addressed. So there's no question that the FOI system needs reform, but it's not reform to wind back access rights. Then we see, for example, with the Linnell Briggs job, the public sector board appointments report that was commissioned by the government from Linnell Briggs back in, I think, now I have to think about it carefully before I say it was 2022 or 2023, and it was provided to government in the middle of the year. There was a commitment to make it public by the end of that year. That report, in spite of many parliamentarians' efforts and media efforts to get access to that report, was only made public just before the end of the year, and because the Senate took decisive action to force the government's hand on it and force its release. So unfortunately, there are really worrying indicators in respect of transparency, and we know that we have sadly a problem with deteriorating public trust. And one of the ways that that can be addressed is for government to be more transparent about how public power is exercised. Because when we don't have this transparency, people feel that executive power is captured or it's insulated from accountability, and transparency is a critical part of addressing that. So I think there are some really worrying indicators of that front at the moment. I might leave the rest to you.
Yeah, and I think it's probably not surprising that no government wants to bring in laws that make it more accountable. It just makes its job harder. So, and the other thing we see on transparency and accountability is the other potential party of government often doesn't really want it either, because they know it'll be a headache for them when it's their turn. So it's on those issues that I think the crossbench has a really important role to play. We kicked up a huge stink over the FOI legislation and got very cross. Catherine was very cross too. Put attention on that, and then it didn't go through the Senate, so it's sort of paused for now. But it was worrying. It's like they'd taken all the problems with the FOI that could be solved by less transparency, but they hadn't addressed any of the problems in the FOI that needed to be solved with more transparency. So it was very one-sided. What was your first question, Bill?
It was really about the trying to identify any AI generated
Labelling, yeah.
or the source. Like it was mentioned that Russia was the source of misinformation and so on. So people can identify this is generated within Australia, or no, it's generated from somewhere overseas, non-Australia. Even that
Look, I don't know about the technical possibility of the geographic labelling, but there has been talk about introducing laws that require you to label something as AI generated. One of the challenges with that is the way things are moving. It's likely that a lot of content will have some AI content in it, and the labelling may become meaningless if you've used AI to optimise the background in your social media video. You'll have to label it, and then it loses its potency. So there are different views on labelling. I don't know if you can show that. Next, where's Kat?
Thank you. A quick question, please. Both of you have mentioned disinformation many times. Can you explain to the audience the difference between the two and how the two are used differently?
It's such an important question. So disinformation, when that's being shared fundamentally in an easy and brief answer. Disinformation is shared intentionally. Misinformation, people share not understanding that the information that they're sharing is not good information, and they don't have an intent to harm when they're distributing it.
We know that like ChatGPT and lots of AI sites are super bad for the environment with lots of water usage, and it's very damaging. Do you think the government will introduce any environmental laws that will help reduce the bad impact that AI has on the environment?
Yeah, good question. I think I haven't heard of any laws that are being proposed on that. I think AI is moving so fast, and there are so many parts that need regulatory attention, and environmental impact is one of those. Now, as I understand it, there are, the data centres, they're looking at different ways of using less water in cooling, but at the moment, really, it's just a full speed ahead, trillions of dollars being invested in it, and this race is on between the US and China, it's really move fast and break things, and I think one of those things is the water usage. But it does feel at the moment like nothing's going to stop that. In terms of Australia's capacity to regulate that, it's pretty challenging. And on AI regulation generally, if we put a whole lot of things in place in Australia that reduce the speed of AI development or how it can be used, I think the general consensus is we just get massively left behind. And that's this is why it keeps me up at night, because if you have that at a global scale, then you're hurtling towards an unknown future with no brakes. And even when the Silicon Valley guys came out and said we need a 6-month pause on AI development because we're working out, because it can be quite dangerous, the consensus was, well, China's not going to stop. So if we stop, we're just going to end up with China having the best model, and then that sucks all the value out of, all the economic value out of all the value chains, and we end up being a mendicant state. So it's this really difficult problem where, in terms of impact on truth, economic value, there are so many, privacy, copyright, all these different things are really collateral damage in this race. And I think when I've been trying to look at how we regulate AI, it's really hard to know as a country what Australia can do. And some people say it's going to happen anyway. The best thing we can do is own a bit of the economic pie and build data centres. That's a really bleak future as far as I'm concerned, that we do need to be actually deciding how is this consistent with Australian values and human values, and be part of those global conversations about how to regulate it better.
Thank you. My name's Carolyn. I wanted to ask a sort of pull the lens out and ask a bit more of a sort of meta question about the sources of the distrust with democracy and people leaning towards things like disinformation and misinformation. and talk about, or ask you what emphasis you would put on economics and economic inequality and wealth inequality if people are feeling like the democratic system is actually sort of gamed towards people like us. And even officers talking about the institutions, we were talking about Catherine, about the Auditor General or the Ombudsman and all these kind of institutions, CSIRO, that they're still, they're working well for privileged people but not working so well for other kinds of people, and whether they're the kinds of people who are being drawn towards extremist views, etc. So yeah, what emphasis would you put on the role of wealth inequality?
Such an interesting question. It's obviously an important part of the picture here. On the distrust front, from my perspective, one of the real drivers of distrust, particularly for disadvantaged groups in the community, marginalised groups, is going to be around the opacity of the exercise of public power, because the experience of these groups, is that public power is not being exercised in their interest. And because our policy, the decisions at which government often arrives at are not transparent, and there's not good public consultation, there's not good lobbying regulation in most places, there's not disclosure of ministerial diaries, people aren't able to see that the power the government wields is exercised in their interest. I think that, from my perspective, is one of the main drivers of the distrust that we see growing. And I agree with you very much that increasing economic inequality is only going to worsen that problem.
I think it's definitely a factor. And you look at Brexit and you look at Trump's rise and disengaged, people who feel like the system is no longer working for them look for something else. And that's I think, we're now seeing some One Nation, a rise in One Nation here. That's part of that too. And that sense of our government is working for vested interests, not for me. I think that really fuels that. So economic factors are definitely part of what's driving that. I suppose I think you can't just solve for that problem, but that needs to be, that is definitely driving it, and it needs to be one of the problems that is solved.
I haven't tried this, but what if you were to ask AI for the accuracy of some of the information or disinformation you get, some of which may have been generated by AI? Would you get a valid answer?
Maybe sometimes.
I actually almost did that this afternoon and ran out of time. I wanted to have an example. I think that's to talk through with you, but no, it's worth a try. Try it and see what happens.
I think maybe a tactic that we will come to in the absence of trust of most institutions is that there will be some AI that is trustworthy enough to assess other AI. And that might be a surprising avenue for an alternative approach.
Yeah, Anthropic, that built Claude, was established by a bunch of guys who didn't like the way OpenAI was going and said we want to do it in a way that puts humanity first. It's not perfect, but I guess it's a start. And there are potentially layers of accountability that can be built into that. Unfortunately, in the last month, AI has shown some ability to deceive in order to pass safety tests. So there's now some concern about publishing research about AI safety, because AI is now able to use that to work out how to pass the test.
Hi there, y'all. My problem is really that it's a great thing to address integrity in government. However, in my time, I've noticed how, say, from the 60s, we started finding out about the cold climate and climatology, and at the same time, big oil started disinforming the world buying out scientists, etc., getting them to say stuff which wasn't quite true. And as wonderful as you all are, I guarantee there's probably people in here who would think that climate change skeptics from the perspective of excess carbon. What I'm saying is that over the last 30 years, there's an industry has grown up, a discrete little industry to sort of to disinform, to give a different opinion on things, to think that it's okay to still keep burning oil in your V8 or whatever. What I'm saying is that what we're looking at here is a combined problem, and the question is the people who sort of are able to perpetuate this, to spawn this, academics and people with the public trust, they need to be made accountable, of course. I wonder how we can pick the people out who should know better, who do know better, but are being swayed with money.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and that, I mean, it's not. You said that with climate. You saw it with tobacco. Very intentional mis and disinformation campaigns. We see it with gambling now, which something I'm closest to. And mis and disinformation is not always used for political purposes, it's also used for commercial purposes. And I guess strengthening those institutions and educating people is the best way to reduce the impact of those vested interests. Now, I don't think that gambling companies should be making donations to political parties or giving free tickets to politicians while also resisting regulation. And there are plenty of examples of that. And so I suppose calling it out, making people aware of it, and creating pressure on government to put checks and balances into those systems that reduce the impact of vested interests feels like it's the only way forward.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely. It's those long-term integrity reforms around bolstering the independence of organisations like the CSIRO, ensuring that they're not able to be defunded if they do work the government finds inconvenient, that they can't be politicised. There's lots and lots that can be done in this space. So, as I say, there's a whole lot of these long-term integrity reforms, aside from strengthening institutions, considering truth in political finance, it's whistleblower protections, and it's lobbying reform, and it's political finance reform that is actually fit for purpose. There's a whole lot of these things. No one solution is going to work. We need to be looking at a whole patchwork of things together.
But the reality is democracy only works if people feel like the leaders are making decisions in their interests. So that's the sort of the meta threat that I think we're seeing globally.
Yes, I just have showing the baby boomers here, legacy media. It's a terrible phrase, but just for a moment here, looking at the issues of trust and who do you believe. We used to have the good guys, bad guys, Rupert Murdoch, Kerry Packer, Mr. Stokes, as the concentration of media, but we had enlightenment as a government. I don't know whether it was Whitlam or Fraser or Hawke, where if you could only own so many assets, for example. So we're talking platforms here, and I know AI is the bogey, but these platforms of free-to-air television, commercial radio, and the big masts, Fairfax and the others, were concentrated with a couple of individuals. So this conversation has been going on a while in terms of power, and now you had to divest, didn't you? I'm just wondering, that sort of all went out the door. We know there are moguls, one or two, that are owning a lot of assets, and the idea of trust and belief as to what you're seeing on TV or reading in a newspaper or hearing is compromised, so we don't need AI for that. But I'm just wondering, Kate, is there any move to talk about this concentration of media owners, and then because from that, I'm just thinking what you said, the great work you're doing with the gambling issue, but I look at Channel 9 and its links to rugby league and the relationship between Albanese and the head of the rugby league, and you go, this is just crazy in terms of what we don't know, in terms of transparency. who owns Channel 9 in terms of a hedge fund and the distribution, who's investing there, and that's manifesting in reputable flags like the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, and they are influencing. When you said here that result, we're still looking at free to air, we're still listening to radio, we're still reading newspapers, and yet there is a hidden hand there that's quite massive.
So I think media concentration is definitely something that needs to be dealt with. It's interesting, I don't think there's any appetite from the government to take on the big media moguls. They're just not willing to risk the negative narrative that comes with it. Which is a shame, and there should be. But at the same time, the landscape is changing so much where they don't have the power they used to. And I think we saw, you would, if you look at what some of the coverage on the political parties, it doesn't actually match up with what's happening at the ballot box. So I think they don't have as much power as they used to, but the government, I don't think, is in a position where they're ready to take that on yet. And we did have those media ownership laws, which were reversed. I can't remember how long ago it was that they were reversed. It's really hard to unscramble the egg, once you have that concentrated ownership. But part of that, I think, is that people Sophie's age are probably not reading those papers to get their news. And there is other independent media, the Shot, name some, the Daily Oz, Crikey, the two advocates are always good for a while. Saturday paper, there are independent media out there, and I think one of the things that individuals can do is actually support those independent media channels. Here we have the Post, which has been independent for 42 years or 43 years. There aren't many communities that actually have a paper that's still fully independent like that. So recognising that we actually need to financially support the media channels so that we do have that diversity is important. But a lot of people, the West is it's a one-paper town, but most people flick through the first couple of pages while they're getting their coffee at the cafe in the morning, and that's it. So I don't think it has quite the potency that the government's not ready to take it on yet.
It's feeling a little overwhelming. I'm trying to come away from this, but I'm grateful for it. How can we need to be discerning. Are there mechanisms by which we as an individual, going about our daily lives, can be more discerning? And for example, if we do a search on the internet and AI comes up, I have no idea where it's being generated from. Is there something you can share with us even later by way of email to help us navigate and maybe choose preferences on our searches or to use search engines in order to try and find reputable, honest and trustworthy means of obtaining information?
I'd love to say yes. So ground news, I think, is worth a look because it does actually show you that bias in real time. In terms of using search engines, I suppose going to the source, looking at, rather than reading the AI summary, clicking on the references or the links, and looking at what is this? Is it a university? Is it a newspaper? What do I know about this newspaper? What else have I learned? The reality is we all use shorthand. We're not going to go and check the original source of every single thing that we read. So you do have to work out which are the sources that you trust. But I think some of those independent media outlets that we talked about are a good place to start. Looking at such, I guess it's asking the question and thinking, if something doesn't look quite right, asking, who's behind this, who's publishing this, what might their interest be, and just having that media literacy to ask the questions about it. I don't have a magic, but I don't have, I think there are sources in Australia that do some things better than others, but I try and read a mix. So I'll read ABC, The Australian, WA Today, Sky, Guardian, so that you see the full picture of things. And I guess that's the best thing we need to do. On media literacy, there is more that we need to do. And the government, I've asked a question about the government's media literacy plan. Is that what it was called? I think media literacy plan. And they said, yes, we'll be working on that in the next few years. But there's no sense of urgency on it.
Hi, Kate. My name's Martine. I work in cybersecurity. My job is actually cybersecurity education for a mining company. It's a multilingual global workforce. So I've been itching to answer some of your questions if you don't mind me contributing that way. In search engines, it's fascinating actually. I'm staying with my mum at the moment while I'm renovating, and we've been having lots of these conversations. I ignore the AI answer altogether. And even before then I was in marketing and PR, and so I would even advise you to ignore the sponsored links at the top, and they've become more increasing in the search engines. And some, if you're using Google Chrome or some of the browsers, allow you, the applications you use to search the internet. So in the settings, some of them allow you to turn off the AI answers. You can Google that to find out how you do that in the browser. But if you go to their website support answers, they usually give you step-by-step instructions on how to turn off the AI answers. And then there was one other around, if you ask AI if it's wrong, will it tell you? I do this all the time. I use AI in my job every day. I will ask, are you sure about the sources and where you're getting this information? And it will say, oh no, I'm sorry. Looks like I was wrong. But if it's anything I want to actually be reliant on, I will go to the sources and read it. And most often than not, if it's if I'm searching for information and I look through the sources, it's all incorrect. So I don't use it. It's called AI hallucinations. They do make up information. So I don't ever really use AI to find answers. I'll use it to create content, or quickly write a thing that I might have been writing for a job. But I don't use AI for searching. And finally, sorry, Kate. The E-Safety Commissioner has a lot of education already online. There's training, they can do it in person and online and stuff. So the E-Safety Commissioner is a federal agency that has lots of education around this stuff. And I'd encourage you all to do it for different ages, young people as well as older people. And
we might share some, thank you very much, it's really useful. We might share some resources to all those who are associated to the event afterwards for those individual tools to make that useful. Now, how are we going with timing? Should I wind it up? Just on 7. Okay. Thank you so much for the great questions. I don't know whether we're leading with a sense of optimism. I guess my sense of optimism is that it's not a hopeless case. There are things that can be done, and we're not America. So
And that's exactly, that's really important. Let's not be complacent about it. We do have the ability to deal with the problems that our democracy is facing, but we have to seize that opportunity and work together to do it.
thank you, and a big round of applause for Catherine.